Welcome, everybody. StephenGray here, and you are watching this on YouTube on the channel StephenGray Vision, or you may be listening to it on anchor.fm as an audio-only podcast. The mission of this project, if you will, is a series of interviews with leading lights in the work of spirituality and awakening humanity and psychedelics in general, and in particular, I suppose. We are happy to have a remarkable human being with us today. Or I am happy to have, very happy, really, and honored is a cliche, but I really do feel that way about this gentleman. And I'm going to read you his bio first, and then I will introduce him or invite or say hello to him, and we'll go from there. So his name is Wade Davis, whose work has taken him from the Amazon to Tibet, Africa to Australia, Polynesia to the Arctic, period. Explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society from 1999 to 2013. He's currently professor of anthropology and the BC Leadership Chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk at the University of British Columbia. That's here in Vancouver. Author of 22 books, including One River, The Wayfinders, and Into the Silence, and a new book which I'll mention in a moment. Winner of the 2012 Samuel Johnson Prize, the top nonfiction prize in the English language. He holds degrees in anthropology and biology and received his PhD in ethnobotany, all from Harvard University. His many film credits include Light at the Edge of the World, an 8-hour documentary series written and produced for the NGS. Davis, one of 20 honorary members of the Explorers Club, is the recipient of 11 honorary degrees, as well as the 2009 Gold Medal from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, the 2011 Explorers Medal, the 2012 David Fairchild Medal for Botanical Exploration, and the 2015 Centennial Medal of Harvard University, the 2017 Roy Chapman Andrews Society's Distinguished Explorer Award, and the 2017 Sir Christopher Ondaatje Medal for Exploration. In 2016, Wade was made a member of the Order of Canada, no small award there. And he has a new book coming out in September with Knopf Random House called Magdalena, River of Dreams. So again, thanks so much for coming on to this, Wade, and sharing your long accumulated wisdom and knowledge. I'm delighted to be talking to you. So how are you doing?
Thanks, Stephen. Wonderful to be with you as always.
Great.
I'm sorry you had to trudge through that bio. I thought you had a shorter one, mercifully.
I should have shortened it up, but that's all right. And at least now people watching and listening know who they're, to some degree, who they're they're hearing from here. Really, you are one of the world's leading voices for ethnic and biodiversity, to say the least. I'd like to just jump right in, if you don't mind, Wade, and ask you something that you've spoken about in talks that you've given, which is basically how have psychedelics informed your life and work?
Well, Stephen, it's funny. We go back to the kind of notorious moment when Bill Clinton said he, tried marijuana, but he didn't inhale. That was such a silly thing to say. And I guess I'm quite the opposite. I very happily and very proudly and acknowledged that not only did I take psychedelics, but that they really transformed my way of thinking. It's interesting, when you look back on the sea change of that swept our culture in our lifetimes, we're in a single generation or two, women went from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. Where suddenly, we were speaking in terms of Gaia and a sense of almost a planetary awareness of our connectedness, where you suddenly have terms like biodiversity and biosphere being part of the vernacular of school children, where every single nation state, in fact, every major political entity, province, department, whatever, now has a ministry of the environment, whereas when I was born, not a single country did. all of these changes are extraordinarily dramatic. I mean, when I was a kid, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was considered a great environmental victory. Nobody spoke of the biosphere. And as I say now, it's part of the language of school children. And when we look back on the catalyst for that dynamic shift in short order, it seems to me that the one ingredient in the recipe of social change, which has been sort of expunged from the record, is the fact that literally millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken and experienced the subjective effects of one of these sacred medicines. And I say very clearly that I don't think I would write the way I write. I don't think that I would have ever embraced and understood the fundamental message of cultural anthropology, which is cultural relativism, as I did. I don't think I would treat women as I do. I don't think I'd understand homosexuality, especially having come from such a sort of, bush environment of British Columbia, growing up in logging camps and so on. I think all of these things were deeply affected by my experience with these substances. I remember so clearly, as you do, Stephen, that at the time our parents were so fearful, and they famously said to us all the time, "Don't take these things, you'll never come back the same." Well, of course, that was the entire point. We grew up, and I think it's for younger people today, and it's funny to speak in these terms. Dennis McKenna and I always joke that we're now considered the venerable old characters of this sort of lineage of Hoffman and Schulte, simply because we're still alive, But when we, I think it's very difficult for young people to realize just what the role of women was as late as the early 1960s, or how we treated the environment. I mean, rivers were catching fire. They were so polluted until the Clean Water Act. Homosexuality was such that, the slightest hint of someone being gay was the end of their career. The racial injustice, the environmental injustice, the war in Vietnam. I mean, we grew up in a time where the world presented us with an image of itself that was not ideal, and we sought alternatives. And I mean, I think that many people of my generation who became anthropologists did so in part. And sometimes people joke that anthropologists love every culture but their own. But I mean, I think that to some extent, we all anthropologists of my age were really just travelers with a fancy title, who went out in search of a more authentic experience. Now, two things I'd say about the psychedelic thing. Famously, Ram Dass or Richard Albert said, "Get the message and hang up." And there's sort of, there's two paths to take with psychedelics. And I have nothing against in any way those who find psychedelics used in a therapeutic or in a spiritual way as an ongoing companion in their life, on the path of life. That is certainly a legitimate path. I tended to explore psychedelics, kind of get the message, and move on, sort of like Ram Dass did, with more interest in sort of meditation and where the realms that they opened to me. How do I get those realms without taking these substances? Not because I had anything against the substances; it was just a path I took. But we shouldn't forget, particularly in this moment of a true, almost miraculous renaissance in the acceptance, recognition of these substances, the final acknowledgement of their immense potential in clinical practice. We should not forget that these substances were indeed inherently subversive. I mean, we can go back right to Joseph Campbell's distinction between the shaman and the priest, where, he famously said that the shaman's goal is to be a catalyst for the individual's wild genius, whereas the priest's role is to kind of socialize the congregation into a collective. He said with the rise of organized religion, the poetry of the shaman became the prose of the priesthood. So these psychedelics, that fire the heart and the imagination of the individual, allowing the individual to transcend ideology, belief, and have direct rapport with the subjective sensation of being in the presence of the divine. It's not for nothing that they're called entheogens, revealing the God within. These things are very subversive, and we shouldn't forget that some of these pioneers of the psychedelic movement were not just harassed, they were virtually tortured. I mean, we now know, for example, that Ehrlichman, who was with Haldeman, the two main White House aides of Richard Nixon, he's on record as saying that, you know, that the war on drugs was a political strategy. They knew in the tumultuous 1960s that the way to secure the support of Southern Democrats and basically people who were not part of that wave of social change and for whom social change of that degree was frightening. Individuals who sort of embraced a dream of America that never existed, but had to presume to have existed to sort of rationalize their uncertainties, their fears, their contempt for the social changes that were sweeping the world at that time. And so to harness that fear, that resentment, Ehrlichman says there were two main things we could do. Go after the African Americans, who we call the blacks, and secondly, go after the quote unquote hippies and drugs. And so these became kind of targets to be exploited in order to reinforce what was clearly this political agenda. And so the whole war on drugs, which after 50 years has left us with more people using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before, at an expenditure of countless trillions of dollars, was conceived from the start essentially as a lie. And people like Timothy Leary, Timothy Leary was sort of reduced to ridicule in a way, a kind of a pop avatar who had his moment and flamed out. Richard Albert, his great colleague, went on to be Ram Dass, who went to his death extremely respected. We must remember that Timothy Leary was the inspiration of Albert, in a sense. And Leary was a very brilliant social psychologist. And he was at Harvard with Albert. And there was a study that came out that suggested that no matter what the psychiatric problem and no matter what the intervention, from shock therapy to whatever, to Freudian analysis, that roughly a third of patients got better, a third got worse, and a third stayed the same. So it was a real crisis of his profession, his academic discipline in a way. And it was right at that moment that Leary heard about the mushrooms through the Life magazine article of Gordon Wasson. And he made a beeline to Cuernavaca and he experienced the mushrooms. And like everybody else, he came back a man or a woman transformed. And he did, of course, become a prisoner of his fame, his famous slogan, turn on, tune in, and drop out. He was a prisoner of that to some extent, but it was also part of the kind of the charismatic coyote or wolf-like character that he was. He was like a raven or something like that. But the bottom line is that the Nixon administration harassed this man in a way that would have broken the spirit of anybody else I can imagine. I mean, this is a man, it's hard to imagine for kids now using marijuana recreationally, completely legally in Canada. But Timothy Leary did not deserve to go to San Quentin, and he certainly didn't deserve to spend months, if not years, in solitary confinement in one of the harshest federal penitentiaries in the United States for the crime of possessing a single joint of marijuana.
I know, that's absurd.
That puts in perspective so when we think of this renaissance of use of these substances, I think it's important for us to recognize that they have always been subversive. They have been tools of liberation, of illumination, and they're very threatening to people. So at any one point in time, that hammer could come back down. And I think that hammer came down very forcibly from the Nixon administration. And that has to be remembered when we kind of do honor for these characters. I mean, one of the cadre of the pioneers in the psychedelic movement that I find so fascinating is a generation before Leary, and Albert. You know, this
The
strange,
beats,
pardon me?
the beats.
No, not the beats in that sense. I'm talking about the academic cadre, you know, you know, the Richard Evans Schultes, the great botanical explorer, Gordon Wasson, the banker at Morgan Guaranty Trust, Albert Hoffman, the chemist at Sandoz Labs in Basel, Switzerland,
Stan
um,
Groff.
Stan Groff, you know, Sasha Shulgin. You know, there was this amazing Weston Labar with his work in peyote. There was this amazing cadre of characters, men and women, um, but largely men, who actually were personally, politically, very, very conservative. I mean, Richard Evans Schultes, I mean, his politics, he would say, would be to the right of Attila the Hun. I mean, he was a total libertarian. Um, and Gordon Wasson was no flaming radical. He was a very serious scholar, but also a vice president at Morgan Guaranty Trust, which I think became J.P. Morgan. Albert Hoffman was a very, you know, or Bo Homestead, for example, their colleague at Karolinska Institute in Sweden. And these characters were, you know, part of that lineage that went back to Louis Lewin, and who wrote the book Fantastica, Kluver, who wrote the first monograph on peyote that Schultes stumbled upon as a young schoolboy. You know, there was a time when the study of these substances was limited to a very small handful of individuals. And what fascinates me is that, you know, we talk a lot about set and setting in the use of these substances, you know, setting being the physical place where you ingest the sacrament, and the setting being the sort of the mindset you bring to it. And we forget that all of us by the 1960s, certainly me by the late 1960s and early 70s as a college student, you know, I went into these experiences with a very powerfully established set, inspired by everybody from the Beatles to other rock and roll bands, to what I had read about from Allen Ginsberg and, you know, Burroughs or the Beats, as you say, or of course Leary and all these characters. But I'm fascinated by these individuals who in the 1930s were exploring these plants and doing so with really no reference points whatsoever. You know, Schultes, when he first went west to study the Native American church and the peyote cult in 1936, I mean, this young man who had never been west of the Charles River, you know, raised in East Boston, you know, too poor even to attend the dorms at Harvard, the first of his family to attend university. And there suddenly is, in the 1930s, eating peyote with the roadman of the Kiowa 3 and 4 nights a week for 8 weeks of his young life. And he clearly went back to Boston, a boy transformed. And so we suddenly find him in 1937 in Washington, D.C., with eminent anthropologists such as Kroeber from Berkeley, student of Franz Boas, you know, testifying before the Senate against the latest attempt to make illegal the use of the plant in sacred context by the Native American church. I mean, pretty heady stuff for a young kid from Boston. So I find that period of time really is extraordinary. I mean, and we could talk about all those men.
Oh yeah, well that's a wonderful background. Thank you. Perhaps you know, actually, you for me, you've opened up a Pandora's box of possible questions. But one of maybe I'll just jump to this one since it's something I wanted to ask you to elaborate on a little anyway. Uh, you have said more than once that you're kind of surprised at how many of the younger generation seem to find ayahuasca, and I believe this was your word, benign for the most part,
Yeah.
whereas for you and your generation, it seemed like, you know, it was terrorizing scenario. So what do you think made that change? Is the question. You know, why is it so different now?
It is such an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of what these substances are, how they operate. You know, Dennis McKenna always speaks of ayahuasca as if it's an animate, living being, a sentient creature, botanical in form, that is somehow deliberately out to rework the consciousness of the world. I don't know if I agree with that scientifically, but metaphorically, I think it's a very powerful image. You know, it's interesting when you go and you spend time with indigenous people, and you watch how they use either yahe or ayahuasca. You know, in Colombia, they tend to make a decoction out of the brew, and in place of Psychotria viridis, they use Diploteris rosbiana, which is another liana, very similar morphologically to Banisteriopsis capi, which probably explains how the the whole MAO synergy thing originated, and we can talk about that. It's a pretty profound insight into the shaman as a natural philosopher. But you know, one time I took with Randy Borman and the Kofan ayahuasca in traditional context, and the next morning we kind of had a post-mortem, and Randy, who speaks fluent Kofan, had been raised there, and the conversation was in Spanish and Kofan, and I was sort of saying to the fellas, you know, boy, this stuff really terrifies me, and they sort of like burst out. Of course it does. That's the point, you know. In other words, if you listen to the way Native people describe ayahuasca or yahe, they often use images like, you know, you're a child nursing at the breast of jaguar woman, and she suddenly tears you from the tip to fling you into a pit of vipers. In other words, this idea of facing down the demon and getting through that. And there's a strong sense that those who are destined to be shaman are the ones who, in a sense, can get through that into a place of illumination. Whereas for most of us, we butt our heads against the wall of the demons, if you will. That's been my experience. And if you think even as sort of pioneering explorers of consciousness like William Burroughs or Allen Ginsberg, you know, when Burroughs went down to the Amazon to look for the ultimate mind-bending high, if you will, and he hooks up with Schultes in 1952, and Burroughs sent by Schultes down to the Putumayo to have an experience with what was then called Yahe in Colombia. You know, Burroughs goes down there, this veteran of 1,000 strange scenes. I mean, a heroin junkie and proud of it for much of his life. Goes down there and sort of within 24 hours is sort of hustled by a pimp, rolled by a thief, and put in jail. And he comes back to Bogota and writes Ginsberg, you know, tail between the proverbial legs, and says, you know, I'm going to give it one more shot, but this time I'm going to stay close to Doc Schindler, as he calls Schultes in the book. And Schultes scores him a bunch of the liana, and Burroughs takes a big dose of ayahuasca or yahe. And as he writes to Ginsberg, you know, he had one cardinal thought, which is that shaman made a specialty of killing gringos. And he pops a bunch of downers and he gets out of that ceremony as fast as he possibly can. He was absolutely terrified of the experience. And all my experiences with ayahuasca have been very much along those lines. And I've always had the sense that at least in individual use, that's sort of the point. Now, by contrast, if you go into societies like Barasana and the Makuna, who we now believe are in some sense the upcountry cousins of the descendants of the great chieftains of the Amazon, you know, they take ayahuasca very differently. They always take it not in any sense as an individual's quest for illumination or for healing or whatever. They take it very much as a collective engagement. You know, they will take ayahuasca for 2 days and 2 nights as part of a complex ceremony in which they don't become, they put on the ritual regalia, which is not decorative. It is the corona of the sun. It is the plumes of the divine. And they don't become symbols of the ancestors. They literally become the ancestors, and they move through sacred space to visit the points of origin. And in this fantastic sort of 48-hour affirmation of the collective, of its history, of its relationship to the forest, you know, celebrating in effect their strongest cultural insight, which is that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. But that is a quintessentially collective experience. And so the shaman, you know, administers the ayahuasca, and he seems to have, in my experience, sort of an uncanny ability to give each individual just the amount that they should take. And so I've always had quite a pleasant experience in those settings, because the shaman's always, without my intervention, given me not sub-threshold doses, but relatively mild doses, which allow me to sort of, at a more level of comfort, become part of the collective and engage in that. And, I say this is not as someone who, reflexively becomes paranoid or something taking these substances. On the contrary, I mean, were you to have asked me in the early 70s, what of all these entheogenic plants would become the popular one, if you will, I would have always said San Pedro cactus,
Mm.
the cactus of the four winds,
Yeah.
the kind of
It's
serious,
getting
or,
its due now, I think. It's
I
beginning to
mean,
get its due now.
unlike ayahuasca, which is tryptamine based,
Mescaline.
mescaline basis, and mescaline tends to be more sensual. It tends to be more grounded. It tends to be physical. The desire, the subjective desire, is to embrace and engage and become one with nature, if you will, in a very powerful way. And I've always found that both non-threatening but absolutely exhilarating. And yes, you're right, Stephen. I mean, people are taking San Pedro now, and it's a lot more benign physiologically than peyote because it doesn't have all these associated alkaloids that cause nausea, although mescaline can cause some slight nausea. But ayahuasca, the curious thing is, as you noted, is that for a whole new generation of young people, and clearly of all these substances, ayahuasca is the one that's become the kind of the global superstar, if you will. I mean, attracting, my God, when we went to Girona, 2,000 delegates at a World Ayahuasca conference, and these weren't drug freaks as I had perhaps thought it might be. These were very thoughtful people from every walk of life, from every nation, thoroughly engaged in the potential of ayahuasca, whether as a clinical practice or philosophically or ethnographically or whatever. And I think it gets back to this idea of set and setting. I mean, Andy Weil always said that to explain set and setting, when families in the Pacific Northwest go foraging for edible mushrooms, he wrote, and they inadvertently eat the psychoactive mushrooms, they end up in the poison clinic at the hospital. When people go looking for the psilocybin mushrooms and find them, they deliberately, they generally experience mild and pleasant intoxication and have a good time. The mushroom hasn't changed. What has changed completely is sort of the set of expectations brought to the experience. And certainly I've noticed that in my own life with something as simple as cannabis, which is not simple, it's a powerful drug. When I was a teenager, and desperate to deconstruct the world that had been imposed upon me, marijuana was a godsend. It made me giggle, it made me laugh, it made me mock, it made me feel apart from and therefore capable of being critical of a culture that I didn't frankly respect a great deal at that time. But as I found as that I grew older and I began to become the architect of my own life, create a career, have a family, create the kind of ordered world around myself that every human being must do to remain productive and sane, I no longer really wanted that world shattered as I had when I was young. So when I got to a point where I found that if I did periodically smoke marijuana, it wasn't a very pleasant experience. But it had nothing to do with the plant. It was all about my place. And I think this is a very important lesson in the use of these substances. It really does depend on where the individual is at in the trajectory of his or her life.
Hmm. And I believe it was Leary, by the way, that coined this term or started this principle of set and setting. But
Uh-huh.
one question that perhaps you might have some thoughts on is, we got into talking about how the younger generations these days seem to be experiencing ayahuasca quite differently. You've talked a lot about the central role of the shaman in these traditional cultures in South America. What do you think okay, let me put it like this. One of the memes or ideas that seems to be floating around now in the communities that I'm connected to, at least, is that we're, in fact, who was it recently? Oh yeah, it was Bruce Damer actually said that the Dalai Lama had said the gurus of the future are no longer individuals; they are the collective. You know, and so what is the role of the shaman now in these modern cultures? And like, if there is a role, who are they, and how do they get there?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that goes on with ayahuasca, it seems, is that when you talk to young people who go down to Iquitos and work with a Shipibo shaman, first of all, there are more Shipibo shaman up and running today around Iquitos than there probably ever were Shipibo people in the tribe. So you have to be a little cautious. I mean, there are a lot of good men and women curanderos, and there are a lot of probably mail order mystics. And we certainly have heard instances of abuse, particularly of young women, from some of these charlatans. But the whole Iquitos like and that has a long lineage. I mean, I remember in 1974, I took ayahuasca on the road between Sibundoy and Mocoa, and that whole area had sort of become a go-to place, in part because that's where Ginsberg and Burroughs had gone. And there were individual shaman on the side of the road offering ayahuasca experiences, yahe experiences, not just to gringos passing through, but to locals and in a sort of folk medicine tradition, ceremonies that were, in fact, very focused on the cleansing and the problems of the individual. But I stress that that is not the way ayahuasca is certainly used in its place of origin. You know, this collective versus the individual is significant. I mean, typically the shaman, you know, the shaman's role, I mean, really is not a universal role. I mean, typically, you know, shamanism grew out of small hunting and gathering societies. You know, shamanism was probably the prototypic religious impulse. I mean, every religion is basically simply asking the question, what happens to us when we die? And every religion and every people are dancing with eternity and trying to come out on top, you know. And shamanism came out of an era, pre-agriculture, pre-Neolithic era, where the shaman was all about the catalyzing the individual's escape, the elevation of the spirit to an altered state of consciousness, which is something that is so ubiquitous in the ethnographic record that it has to be seen as a basic human appetite, this desire to periodically shift consciousness and to get into these distant states of, and that idea that by going there you can work your deeds of medical and mystical and magical rescue, you know, is part because of the idea that shamanism has about the nature of illness and disease and misfortune that is caused not by pathogens alone, but a state of imbalance that must be addressed. And the shamanic path very much grew from that era. And of course, there are multiple ways of getting into that space. And in the Americas, the route has been these curious plants. But it's one of the great anomalies of botanical science is that of the 120 known hallucinogenic agents, mostly all from plants, 90% are from the Americas, and not because of forests of Equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia were depauperate. People there had other routes to the divine, spirit possession, meditation, ordeal, the vision quest, whatever. But in the Americas, these plants became kind of the vehicle to the Godhead. And one role of the shaman as healer and physician, priest and physician as one, because the body's condition is reflective of the state of the spirit and vice versa, is to kind of envelop the user of these powerful substances in a protective cloak of ritual, which can be both supportive and also mediate some of the stunning pharmacological effects and the psychological effects of taking these substances. You know, it's a shaman who, at one level, deals with the bombardment of stimuli and gives them form, making sense out of sensation, order out of disorder, you know, harmony out of disharmony. But the shamanic role is a complex one. You know, we have a kind of idea of the shaman always as a woman or a man, curandero, bruja, paye, whatever. benign and benevolent, and chanting a lot with feathers and bells and feathers and cleansing bonnets of leaves or whatever. I mean, that's I guess a certain kind of shaman. But I mean, most shaman I've worked with have always had a kind of a mischievous, even psychotic side to them. I mean, they are, after all, the ones who elect to go into these dimensions. They're the ones who are the religious specialists, in the same way that in our own even Judeo-Christian tradition, we're perfectly happy to delegate certain individuals to handle the spiritual challenges of our lives, priests, rabbis, etc., as the rest of us get on with their daily lives. So too in these cultures, the shaman is sort of delegated to deal with that stuff, as Joseph Campbell said, that to go into the waters the rest of us would drown in. And a lot of I've been with many shaman who, at the moment of your biggest crisis, having taken some weird plant, they simply go to bed. And and also in some societies, in the Barasan and Makuna, for example, would never describe the shaman as a healer or a priest, really. A much more meaningful analogy would be that of a nuclear engineer who periodically goes into the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. I mean, in other words, the shaman is and I think this would have been true in the absence of entheogens in the high Arctic. If you think of the role of the shaman in Inuit culture, it's not, yes, there's a certain interaction. Yes, there's a consultation process that can happen for sure. Yes, the shaman is embraced by the community, but very much the shaman lives alone, and it's like the witch in the forest or something. The idea that they're out there alone dealing with this stuff so that we don't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that,
Wade, if I may say so, this is a very interesting, I think, relevant subject for the current times, because perhaps, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. A lot of us are thinking that there are just too many people who, spend 3 months in Peru or so and come back and declare themselves a shaman or an ayahuasquero,
yeah.
without it's as if they don't know what they don't know. I've heard it said by Native American church elders, for example, that, the roadman, and that is the person that runs the ceremonies in that world. This is not a path you choose, they say. It's a path that chooses you.
I think that's very true. I mean, in every single instance, for example, if we go back to that anecdote about sort of doing the post-ceremony debriefing with Randy Borman and the Kofan, one of the things that was so fascinating is all the Kofan were sitting right beside me on various ranks. So I was looking at the faces of all 12 men, kind of thing. And as they were talking to me in Spanish and explaining whatever, Randy was sort of doing an ongoing commentary in English, and basically saying, "Oh, he talks a lot, but he wanted to be a shaman. He didn't have what it was take." It's not a trivial passage, and it's not a trivial a calling. I'll tell you not a funny, but a interesting story. When I was a park ranger in British Columbia, I had a very good friend who was, we had what he saw to be a vision. And, and this golden eagle came back our way. I saw it as a coincidence, forgot about it. He embraced it. Doesn't matter whether it was quote unquote true or not. He left his job as a park ranger, and he literally dedicated about 7 years of his life to seeking that golden bird. And he would go into the wilderness alone, 6 and 7 months in the remote reaches of northwest British Columbia, spend the rest of his time alone in a hut in the Souk Hills outside of Victoria. In meditation, he created a religion out of this. He called it the Eagle Scripture. He took regular doses of psychedelics and so on and so forth. And one time I was talking to Johannes Wilbert, who at UCLA, who was an authority on shamanism of the Winikino Warao in the Orinoco Delta. And Douglas Sharon came out of that department, and Castaneda had been there. And I said to Johannes, I'm going to tell you about a friend of mine. And I'm going to tell you what he does, but not who he is or what ethnicity he is. So I proceeded to describe to this great professor my friend's daily round and monthly round and annual round. And then at the end of this detailed description, Johannes said, that is the pure shamanic path.
Mm.
And then I told him who this person was and where all this was unfolding. And he then said immediately, reflexively, that's a recipe for psychosis. In other words, if you enter these shamanic realms, it's not for the faint-hearted. And if you don't have a community to welcome you home, a kind of a cloak around your experimentation, a kind of a community to give you a reason to be, to make sense out of your sacrifices, your ordeals, your agonies, as part of your initiation, your solitude, amongst other things. It's not necessarily a ticket to mental illness, but it can be very challenging. And so, it's like a friend of mine, Mathieu Ricard, once said in a very different setting in the high Himalayas. We were making a film on the Buddhist science of the mind. After all this sort of Baroque and esoteric discussion of the Dharma, he just said very simply, it is not about the twiddling of thumbs. There's 2,500 years of direct empirical scientific observation in the case of Tibetan Buddhism as to the nature of mind. Well, by the same token, shamanism is not about the twiddling of thumbs. It represents our primordial impulse as a species. And I think I've always thought that you could go back. It's one of the things that I find doesn't get spoken about enough, but I find incredibly fascinating, is the Upper Paleolithic cave art in Southwest France, where I've spent quite a bit of time underground. And the most fascinating thing about that is that tradition is that the same fundamental aesthetic, the same technology, the same aspirations artistically, can be traced in direct lineage from Chauvet 32,000 years before now to Lascaux 17,000. Now that chronological distance is 5 times the chronological gap that separates us from the building of the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt, right? So for all that time, we were over 20,000 years, we are expressing ourselves in a very similar way, in a very similar setting, presumably anticipating somewhat similar outcomes. And so what is that art? It's not hunting magic. That makes no sense whatsoever. Prey animals aren't depicted. Hunters aren't depicted. There's almost no violence depicted. I had a friend of mine, a poet, Clayton Eshelman, who wrote a beautiful book called The Juniper Fuse, who had spent really his life underground, in that saturated by the visions of those depictions of animals on rock. And he sort of suggests, if at one point we're all of an animal nature, by definition, we know that in terms of the evolution of life before the rise of Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthal, we were at some point as hominids animals, and at some point we weren't human beings. We had consciousness. We had, whether it was a increase in the size of the brain or the invention of language, some other evolutionary catalyst. At some point we had consciousness and no longer were animals. And we used to think of this cave art as sort of a deliberate attempt to reach back what had become an unbridgeable chasm between our human nature and our animal nature, to evoke a time when we were as one. And he described the cave art as sort of postcards of nostalgia. But if these were postcards of nostalgia, ours was a very long farewell to our animal nature. And it seems to me that the shamanic role is still, in a sense, an attempt to rekindle that connection, that direct connection that was irrevocably lost over the course of the development of modern humanity.
Well, I love the way you brought that full circle, Wade. Nicely done. Okay, so before we run out of time, we've still got lots of time left in my view, but I want to get a little bit more focused toward. You've spent a lot of time with indigenous people in South America that as a general group, you've referred to as the people of the Anaconda, and more specifically the Barasana. And one of the things you've talked about regarding them, which I think is potentially very relevant for us so-called moderns. Basically, I guess the simplest question is, what do we have to learn for our future from their understanding of their worldview, their understanding of the cosmology of the world? For example, I'll just give you a couple of examples of things you've said. That you've said that, for example, linear time doesn't exist for them. They don't have language for linear time. You've talked about how no event is separate from everything else, and objects even are not just symbolic but connected to everything else. So I guess, again, because we're talking to presumably, people in the so-called modern cultures for the most part today, what is it that we moderns can learn from the example of peoples like the Barasana?
Well, let me start by challenging the word modern, because the antithesis, the opposite of that, presumably, is primitive, and neither concept has any meaning whatsoever.
Okay.
Because modern just means now, but
That's what I
everybody,
meant by it. Yeah.
yeah, but everybody's
Current.
now. One of the things is that we have this dichotomy. And one of the reasons I sort of am uncomfortable with the term indigenous people,
Mm.
because it implies that there's this kind of cohort, uniform in their characteristics, in a kind of dichotomy between them and us, the moderns, right? The truth of the matter is there's 7,000 different languages spoken on Earth, and every culture is a reflection or the expression of the heart of a unique culture. And when we at the same time, all cultures tend to be myopic, faithful to their own interpretation of reality, including the Barasana. I mean, most native names mean the people. The implication being that anyone else is beyond the horizon is a savage or something. We certainly had that in Greek, in Greece, with the notion of the word barbarian, from the word barbarous, one who babbles. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. I mean, Plato wanted Herodotus killed because he had the audacity 400 years before Christ in saying, in the wake of his travels, that something rather interesting was going on over in Persia, and Plato saw that as a betrayal. And so we, in our fidelity to our own way of thinking, we tend to view the rest of the world as failed attempts at being us, or failed attempts, in our case, at being modern. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? Every culture has something to say, just as each deserves to be heard, and none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. And so it's important to realize that the way we think, our worldview, doesn't exist outside of culture and history. It's a product of both, right? And if I were to identify the one trait of thought that distinguishes many indigenous people from ourselves, it's that in our tradition, we can trace this back very specifically. When we tried in Western European civilization to finally liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, when we tried to liberate the individual from the tyranny of the collective, which was a sociological equivalent of splitting the atom, when Descartes said that all that exists is mind and material, the insight that gave rise to the scientific method, which allowed for so many great things, from going to the moon to allopathic medicine. But in that single phrase, as Saul Bellow would say, science made a house cleaning of belief. We swept away all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, and metaphor. Phenomena that could not be seen, quantified, and measured could not exist. And yet, the earth in a gesture was de-animated. The idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning was ridiculed. The earth itself became, in a sense, a stage set upon which only the human drama unfolded. Plants and animals were just props on that stage set. And inevitably, if we de-animate the world, we change our relationship to it. And so that a child raised in Canada to believe that a mountain is just a pile of rock is going to be a different kid with a different relationship to a mountain than a youth in the Andes of Peru raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct his or her destiny. Now, the point isn't who's right and who's wrong. Is a forest just cellulose and board feet, as you and I were raised to believe, or is it the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven, as a Kwakwakwa were raised to believe? It's not who's right and who's wrong. It's how the belief system mediates a relationship with profoundly different consequences for the ecological footprint. So our interaction with the natural world, mandated in part by our biblical texts, is fundamentally one of exploitation and extraction. Now, those words have become loaded as if they're inherently pejorative, negative terms. I mean them just strictly as descriptions. We exploit an inanimate world for our well-being. We build things with what we extract from the ground. The key point, for better or for worse, is that most societies, meaning most expressions of the human heart, spirit, and intuitions, do not have that kind of dynamic whatsoever. Their relationships are based universally on reciprocity. The simple idea that human beings are part of a bigger entity, that the earth owes us its bounty, but in exchange, we owe the earth our fidelity. And ironically, in the world of our thinking, human beings are seen as a problem, whereas in most indigenous cultures, human beings are not only not the problem, they're the solution, because the world can only become manifest, the divinity of the world can only become manifest through the human awareness and human consciousness. But the point is that if we look around the world, the way we think about the world, even if it's yielded great material benefit, is highly anomalous in the human experience. And we can see very clearly that it's brought us to a rather dire place in terms of the environment. And obviously one of the underlying messages of the COVID crisis is that it's time for us to wake up and realize that we really are biological beings living on a biological planet. We are not separate from nature. We are both part of nature and dependent upon our relationships to nature. So if you go back to the Bodhisattva, where your question began, yes, it's true, they have no notion of time, no concept of losing time, making time, robbing time, stealing time. And these are sort of poetic notions and very intriguing. But the most powerful of their consequences of their beliefs is the fact that their mythology, when deconstructed, essentially amounts to a very sophisticated land management plan that dictates precisely how human beings can live in the upland rainforest of the Amazon without tearing it asunder. So, I think this is, if I were to say, what is the message of these other societies? It's that there is a way of interacting with the natural world, which does not imply impoverishment, but in wealth beyond imagining. So that, just to finish that thought, let's go to the one part of the human experience, or the civilization, if you will, that in its beliefs is most antithetical to that of the West. And that brings us into the heartland of the Aboriginal people of Australia. It's fascinating. We know from studies of the Y chromosome, the Aborigines, their ancestors, were probably the first humans to walk out of Africa. And they crossed the underbelly of Asia in 5,000 years, crossed the waters that even then separated what is now New Guinea from the most parsimonious continent on earth, and then they went walking. And they established 10,000 clan territories, all linked together by this idea of the dreaming, which was not a dream. It was a concept that the world at your feet both existed and yet was eternally waiting to be born. And when the British arrived in Australia, they saw people that looked strange, who had a very simple material technology. But what really offended the British was that the entire continent was inhabited by people who had no interest whatsoever in progress. in improving upon their lot, in changing the material circumstances of their lives. And the British, for whom those values were paramount, defining in the age of European settlement of Australia, they, in their inimitable way, concluded that the Aborigines weren't even human, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne, Australia, as to whether or not Aborigines were human or not. As recently as the 1960s, a friend of mine, an anthropologist in Alice Springs, once told me he, in his school, had to study a book that was used in classrooms across the country, a book called A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, which included the Aborigines as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife in the continent. 1960s, Stephen, when you and I were both kids. Now, what was missing in the analysis of the British and all outsiders was the inability to appreciate this subtle devotional philosophy. The entire purpose of life in Australia was the antithesis of change and progress. The entire purpose of life was not to change anything, but to the contrary, do the ritual gestures along the song line that went through your clan territory, the ceremonies that were deemed to be essential, not to change the world, but to keep the world exactly as it was at the time of the Rainbow Serpent. Everything was focused on changing nothing at all. Now, the interesting thing is if we had all, as a species, embraced that devotional trajectory, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon. But we would have just pruned the shrubs in the Garden of Eden, keeping it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. We wouldn't have grown materially wealthy, I suppose. We wouldn't have created the architecture of our cities, but we also, one has to add, wouldn't be talking about climate change and our species' ability to transform the biological and physical life support systems of the planet.
Yeah, one of the ways, one of the what would you call it, archetypes or ideas about, who we are in these, again, there must be a better term than modern. Sometimes people use the word Westerners or
Contemporary.
whatever, contemporaries, okay, is that we kind of had to we went through this individuation process, and now we're at the point where we have to come back to recognizing the connection to source.
Well, look at COVID. I mean, I just wrote this 6,000 word piece for Rolling Stone, looking at COVID as a cultural phenomena. If you look at the countries that managed to control this challenge, it's all because of the strength of their social solidarity. And the United States, more than any other country, and particularly post-World War II, celebrated the individual at the expense of community. In fact, it's gotten so far that the Americans don't even believe in the notion of society. No one deserves anything. There's no safety net. People have to fight for everything, and what we're seeing is a consequence of that. I mean, Canada has done so well in COVID, particularly in places like British Columbia, because of the strength of our social solidarity. The wealth of a civilization is not the currency secured by the lucky few, but rather the strength of relationships enjoyed by the many. When I try to explain the difference between what happened in Canada to what happened in the United States to American friends, of whom I've got many, I always ask them to reflect on the last time they went to get their groceries at Safeway. Now, when you get your groceries at Safeway in the United States, there's generally a economic, educational, racial, and class chasm between you and the checkout person that is unbridgeable. You don't have that experience in Canada. Why? Not that you necessarily are, you engage each other as peers, but you do so as part of a wider community. And you may be more affluent, more educated than the person at the checkout counter, or they may be more affluent, and who knows. But the point is, they know that that they're getting a decent wage because of the unions. And that they know that probably your kids go to the same public school in the neighborhood. And third, and most importantly, they know that that if their kids get sick, they get not only the same care that your kids get, but prime minister's kids get. And those three strands woven together become the fabric of social democracy. And it's that strength of solidarity that allows a people to confront something like COVID, to the point where a state like Massachusetts, which is not even a hard hit state, roughly the same population as the province of British Columbia, has 40 times the mortality of British Columbia, even though we are right up the road from Seattle, where the pandemic first landed in North America.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of connectivity is really a fundamental one.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So we're getting a little long here. I mean, we could talk all day, obviously, or you could anyway. You have so much to share with people. But I want to squeeze in two more questions, if I may. And one of them is, you have said in one of your other talks that I don't remember I haven't got the exact quote of how you put it, so correct me if if I didn't get the nuance right. But you've said that you are optimistic about where we're going. It's like you believe in our capabilities somehow. Can you explain or elaborate on that thought?
Well, Stephen, I always think pessimism is an indulgence, despair, an insult to the imagination. Orthodoxy, always the enemy of invention. I'm a father, so I have to be optimistic. And one of the ways that I've maintained my optimism is through, in a sense, detachment. I mean, one of the things that I learned from Buddhist studies is that the path of life is not leading to a destination. It's aiming, obviously, for a state of mind. And one of the things that we do in the Judeo-Christian tradition is we sort of set up this opposition between the Christ child and the fallen archangel, the devil, and we have them do battle all the time. And always the hope is that somehow, good will triumph, that evil will be vanquished from the world. And I think that's an illusion. And in Eastern religious thought, evil is kind of embraced as part of existence. When Lord Krishna was asked that famous question, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil to exist, period? If a Christian monk in the medieval times asked that question, it was a heresy. They were burned at the stake because the question had no answer. But in the Vedic scriptures, it has an answer. Lord Krishna turned to the student who had asked him, why is there evil in the universe? And Lord Krishna said, to thicken the plot. In other words, if you accept, and that's why if you think of the second of the noble truths, all life is, the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of people clinging to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. And the first noble truth, that all life is suffering, he didn't mean that all life was negation. He just meant that negative things happen as a result of karma, and that's part of life. And the minute you stop seeing victory as a goal, a world where evil is vanquished as an opportunity, suddenly things lighten up. My father, who was not a religious man, but he was a thoroughly decent man, used to just say to me, Wade, there's good and evil in the world. Take your pick and get on with it. In other words, if you have that attitude, it helps a lot. What is bitterness? Bitterness comes to people in old age who either look back on a life of decisions imposed upon them, individuals who failed to achieve the great challenge of life, which is to become the architect of your own life, or people who look back because of failures, in the environmental movement, people burn out because they lost that battle to save that mountain. But if you realize that that's not the goal, you win some, you lose some. What matters is the fight, and that if you lose one battle for one important landmark on the planet, okay, you move on to the next one. I lived with nomadic Penan. With a whole bunch of friends, we worked extraordinarily hard to draw attention to their plight, and yet within a single generation, a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, was crushed with the force that gave it birth. And that was a very disappointing moment for everybody involved, but it didn't stop me going on to write a book like The Wayfinders, to celebrate the wonder of what culture represents. Or, it's like if you read this new book of mine, Magdalena, River of Dreams, it's kind of amazing. I'm 66 years old, but I still write with a kind of a freshness and an optimism and a such that a book like that has been described as a love letter, a 430-page love letter to Colombia, a country that, as I describe in the book, has not deserved its agonies. But certainly what allows me to keep going at my age and hopefully still be able to inspire young people, as I think I do as a professor, with my books and other things, is that I still share hope, and I really do believe that despair is an insult to the imagination. We've got one life to live. We're not going to change the world, but we are a part of the world, and that brings with it certain moral and ethical obligations.
Well, beautifully said. Thank you so much, Wade. And I think that's a really lovely, uplifting note to kind of wind down on. Although, could you hold up the cover of the book? You have it right there, I
Sure, I
believe.
do have a copy. This is a shameless promotion, but
Yeah.
these days in COVID, we all have to. It'll be out in mid-September with Knopf and Random House, and um, anyone who's has ever thought of going to Latin America, or intrigued by Colombia, the most amazing musical tradition probably on earth, would enjoy this book.
I'm pretty sure I will be one of the first purchasers. Before I say my final thank you and goodbye on the recording here, are there any other links or information? I'm going to run this through Final Cut Pro, so I can put little title tabs and things like that
Uh-huh.
on there. So, are there any
Um,
other things that you would like people to look at?
I guess you could put my website up, or my Instagram. Maybe I'll email you both the Instagram and the website. Would that be
Sure.
okay?
Yes, but if you have them in mind, can you also say them? Because one of the
Oh,
venues
sure,
for
sure.
this is going to be
Yeah,
an
Stephen.
audio
Sure, sure,
podcast.
of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, Stephen, I'd be delighted to. If I can remember, the website is www.daviswade.com, and Instagram. Well, I think you could probably search Instagram by my name, but uh, yeah, it's W Davis Instagram at gmail.com. No, that's not right. Is it supposed to be a hashtag or something, right? I'll have to get
Sure.
that to you.
Yeah. Okay.
But
No
people can
worries.
find me on Instagram.
They will find you.
I've just revealed my complete status as a Luddite when it comes to these things.
Oh well, we are from a certain generation.
We
So
certainly
some
are.
some people got to start at it when they were about 4 with their iPads in the living room. Yeah. Um, okay. Well, wonderful. I'm really delighted about this, Wade. I think well, I don't think I know you shared some really relevant and important information to people for people today, and I hope lots of people see this and hear this. So thank you again.
My pleasure, Stephen. Great seeing you.